All right, so I'm going to talk about Wordle. If you don't know what Wordle is, it is a online game that blew up for some reason. It became really popular. A lot of people were playing it, tweeting about it, so much that I had to add Wordle to my exclusion list on Twitter so I didn't see my timeline filled up with Wordle things. But it's a word guessing game. So New York Times bought it from the original creator. They paid $1 million+ for this. And the idea is you can type a word. So I can type great. And a lot of the letters came back as gray. That means that that is not in my word at all. However, the T is in the word, but it's in the wrong place. So I can try something else like moths. Now I'll have the M and the O in the correct place. The TH are in the wrong place. So I can try again. So let's try month. And I got the word correct. So that's essentially what Wordle is. It's just a word guessing game. And that's what we're going to recreate. I did take a look at the source code for Wordle, and granted it's minified. However, you can see quite a bit of the kind of business logic going on in there. And needless to say, it's pretty crazy, all of the things that they're doing. So my implementation or my version of this isn't quite the same because they are using on the letters, these are kind of like images that they're using instead of input boxes, but we're just going to use input boxes instead. So let me go ahead, get my slides going. So I'm David Kimura. You can find me on Twitter at Cobalts. I think pretty much everyone here is following me or has heard of my Twitter account. And same way with Drift and Ruby is the screencast site that I run. And it is driftandruby.com. You can find it at Drift and Ruby on Twitter. And so we're going to be building Wordle. And this is the implementation that I have created for Wordle, where we've taken a lot of the key components of the game with being able to have the same kind of color coding of the letters that you're guessing, as well as a little keyboard that you are able to kind of visually see what letters you have guessed, which ones you haven't attempted yet. And so just to kind of recap some of the instructions on how to play the game, you type a 5-letter word. Yellow result means that you have the correct character, but it's in the incorrect spot. Gray result means the character is not used in the word at all. And then you have the green result, which is the right character in the correct spot, and you do have only 6 attempts. And so in recreating this, I did have to play the Wordle game a lot to try out different things and to just kind of understand the mechanics that it was doing. And I came up with a list of some key components that are required in order to kind of claim this to be a clone. So we have a single letter input. So I'm using input boxes instead of a image where you listen for keystrokes. And so each input box can only contain 1 letter. Once we type a letter, I wanted to move and focus on the next input box. We need to be able to handle backspacing. So if I type a word incorrectly, fat finger it or whatever, then I'm able to backspace it. And once we type the 5th letter of the word, we check to see if the word is correct. So we kind of go through that check logic. We want to have a display of the keyboard below the game and update the virtual keyboard with the results after we attempt each word. After the 6 guesses, then we want to display the result of the game. Or if you guess the word correctly in less than 6 attempts, then we want to go ahead and halt the game, disable all the keys, and say that you won. If you did not win, then it'll tell you what the word was. And we're going to do all of this with Stimulus.js. We don't really need Hotwire for this, but we're just going to be using the JavaScript portion of it. And it's pretty complicated from the fact that we have a lot of moving parts here in one kind of component or one view. However, I think I've managed to make it simple enough to follow along to where the code's going to be laid out fairly simple, hopefully. So on a fresh Rails application, you can do this with a Rails 5, 6, 7, doesn't matter, because we are just going to be using stimulus.js. I'm going to generate a stimulus controller, and we'll just call it Wordle. So once you have the stimulus controller created, you will have a app, JavaScripts, and then a controllers, and then Wordle controller file. Within that file, we'll get to in a few minutes. That's where we're going to put all of the business logic around this code, around this game. However, we do need to update the HTML to then consume it. So I'll kind of lay out the HTML where we first have a div, this outer div. So from lines 1 through 9, we have a data controller equal to Wordle. And that is essentially going to tell stimulus we are attaching in our view here a controller, and the controller is going to be Wordle. So any kind of constructor or destructors or any business logic that's going to be handled is going to be handled and touching potentially anything within this div element. So any of its children. I'm then also passing in a value. So with a data words value on line 3, you can see that I'm then just inserting in a words list. And that words list is just a simple Ruby class with a global variable or a global class variable with an array of words. So I'm just passing in the whole smash into the stimulus controller to then select a random word. So we then have our 3 different key components of the game. We have our game board, we have the keyboard, the little virtual keyboard below the game, and then we need to display some kind of results. So for the game board, I'm simply just going to iterate over using Ruby to generate the HTML. So we're going to have 6 different rows, and each row will have 5 input boxes, and each input box will contain 1 letter. So you can see where on line 1, we have our iteration of 6. So that's going to then create 6 different divs. Each div will then have 5 different columns, and each one of those columns will have within it an input box, and that input box is simply just a type of text, and it has a max length of 1, as you can see on line 9 here. This input box also has a few different specific things. So just on line 8, we have a class. I'm using Bootstrap in this example, so I have a form control just to make it look nice. But then I'm also adding in some Bootstrap classing for text center, text uppercase, just to keep things consistent for a more visually appealing game experience. But then on line 6 and 7, that's where we're actually doing something with the stimulus controller. So we have the data Wordle target, and we're just calling it input. So that means that on this game, each game that you play, we have 5 columns, each have an input, and we have 6 rows, each having those 5 inputs. So we have a data Wordle target equal to input on each one of these. Unlike an ID, when you are creating a HTML element, you can have only one ID with the exact same name. However, with a data target or a stimulus controller target, you can have multiples. So we have basically an array of inputs that we're then going to be able to use and iterate over. So arrays in JavaScript, much like Ruby, start at the position 0. So a data Wordle target or the stimulus controller Wordle target input of the first one, 0, would be the very top left input box on our game. We then have a data action. And so a data action is essentially, it's tying back to the stimulus controller. And we can perform or listen, basically create an event listener on some kind of action. We can do it on a key down, a key press, a key up. And then we can then send this to a particular function within our stimulus controller. So on line 7, we have our data action. We're listening for any kind of key down. We are then sending this to our Wordle stimulus controller and to the key press function. So much like this, and with our virtual keyboard, I'm just going to do a iteration. So for the keyboard, I basically just manually typed out all the keys on the keyboard in a QWERTY style. And I did add one additional thing, and that is the delete key. So if you actually want to play the game pressing the buttons instead of typing them on your keyboard, you're able to do that as well with this implementation of the clone. Yes, yeah. So essentially, I just grouped these up into into an array. Each letter we're going to iterate over, and then that will give us essentially a 3-row keyboard. And we also have, if you look at line 8, the most important part here is we have another data action. And because these are buttons, I don't have to specify a specific event listener for a button. It's automatically going to be clicked. So I didn't have to insert that in, but I am still sending it to the Wordle stimulus controller. And instead of doing a key press action, we're doing a insert character function. So it's a little bit different, but it just kind of shows the power that you can do with the stimulus controller. We now have so far one input that we are then able to have multiple event listeners that are all going to interact with this stimulus controller. And then we have finally the result. And the result is just a H2 heading tag, and we have our data Wordle target, and we're setting that equal to result. So if you remember back at a few slides ago, we had our class list of all the different words, and this is just what I scrounged up on the internet for random 5-letter words. So in this particular game, these are all the different choices that you have. And the Wordle clone actually does something very similar. They send all of the words that are part of the game into the JavaScript, then it just picks a random one. And so the stimulus controller is going to be a fairly basic stimulus controller where a lot of this, like lines 1, 2, 3, yeah, yep. So with the stimulus controller, I've first assigned the static values, and the values is coming from that words, and it is an array. So the idea there is a value is something that you set when you are first initializing the stimulus controller in the view, and then you are able to pass some kind of value in there, specifying the data type. And in this case, with it being an array, I now have access to all of the array of words that were provided from the Ruby backend. We then have our 3 different targets, the input, which is the different input boxes, the result, and also the button, which is on the virtual keyboard. So when this stimulus controller via the action view first appears on the page, it's going to call the initialize function. And the initialize function is similar to like a constructor where this is going to get triggered almost immediately. And I'm setting a instance variable essentially called this.word on line 8, and then we are calling the function word select. So whenever you have this dot word or this dot selection or this dot wrong letters equals, you're basically setting the initial state of these variables. I didn't have to do let or anything like that or a constant on these because this being the stimulus controller is already defined, and now I'm just defining some additional attributes within there. So the very first thing that we're going to do is generate our random word. So we have on line 8, this dot word is equal to this dot word select. And if we look at that word select function down at the bottom, we're just simply returning this dot word's value. So the word's value, that attribute was created by the stimulus controller's static value on line 4. So that got passed in from action view into the stimulus controller, the array of words, and then we now have access to use it and can manipulate it however we want. And I just found some random selector on the internet, math.floor, math random times this dot words value length, so the length of the array. So this will select our random word, and it's returning it, and it's just loading it into the memory. And so these other functions, the connect function, key press, insert characters, and the rest of them, those are different functions that we're going to be able to call on within the stimulus controller to do all the business logic. Once the stimulus controller has initialized on the page, so you go to the page where this game is, and it initializes, it'll then immediately call the connect function. So the connect function, we can do whatever we need to do to basically initialize or to start the game. So if you remember on one of the previous slides, let me back up to the view here. On line 10, I have disabled set. So all 30 input boxes are going to be disabled by default. And because they're disabled by default, once you come to the page, we need to enable the very first one so that we can start playing the game. So the connect function, I call this input targets because the input targets is referencing the array of inputs that we had. We can pluralize this to targets instead of target normally in a stimulus controller, and then we can then pass in a value. This dot selection is a variable in the initializer that we set to 0. So we can get the very first input box, we can disable it with a dot disable equals to false, and then we can also put our mouse cursor there so we can start typing. So we can call this dot focus. So now the game is initialized, we are able to start typing a character. There's two different ways we can tell the application that we want to start playing. We can type a letter on our keyboard, or we can click one of the buttons on the bottom on the virtual keyboard. And if you remember, each one of those had a data action. Go into the Wordle, the keyboard presses went to the key press, and the virtual keyboard went to the insert character function. So the key press event, this one is a little bit complicated. So when we press a key, we want that key to then display in the input box, but then we also want to iterate to the next letter or the next input box. We want to disable the previous one. We want to enable the next one and set our focus. So yeah. So luckily, in my testing, this actually works pretty well. I didn't run into any kind of weird bugs. And that's probably because on line 2, I did a event prevent default. So essentially that means regardless of what the normal and standard interaction, what that would actually do, I don't want to do that. I want to halt it. We are just going to execute the code within this function instead. So the first thing I do is call a switch, and I listen, or I'm checking for the key code event. And essentially, the only one that I really care about is the backspace key. So that is a numeric value 8 for the key code. So if you hit the backspace, then it's going to call the function delete character, and then it's going to exit out. So that's a conversation for a few minutes from now. But the main thing here is in the default. So I am essentially on line 9 doing a regex text, because if someone enters in a numeric value or hits Command, Alt, Control, or something else like a meta key, I don't want to take those into consideration. I only want when you are typing one of the 26 characters, and I don't care the case. It can be uppercase, lowercase, doesn't matter. I'm testing that, and I'm making sure that the key length is 1. That shouldn't be needed. It should work without that, but it's just a precaution.
Belt and suspenders. You never know what you're going to get.
Yep. Never trust the user's input, essentially. So,
and also, if you ever have an else condition where it's like, this will never happen, guess what will happen?
Yep. So on line 10, if you remember when we initialized the stimulus controller, I created an empty array of wrong letters. And what we will do essentially is push the letters that we were attempting into this array. And if you typed a letter that is not in our word at all, then I don't want it to appear on the screen. I just want the user to essentially try again. So we have a guard clause, essentially, that we are checking this array that we're going to populate with wrong letters, and we want to see if it includes the key that we are testing out here. So if it does include a key, so you've typed in a character that you've already been told is not correct, then we're going to escape out of this function, and we're not going to proceed. So one thing I did find, and this probably is what you were mentioning, Frank, is where the key press doesn't always work exactly how you want. And I may have run into that, which is why I did line 11, where I am grabbing the input target for the one that is currently visible that we're working with, and I'm setting its value to the event key. So even though you press the letter on your keyboard, it's going to do the event prevent default on line 2, so it's not going to do anything, but then we are setting the value of that input box with JavaScript. We are then calling increment character, and the increment character will simply disable the current input box. We're then going to advance to the next one and enable that one. And then finally on line 13, for the previous character that we just pressed, the previous input box, we're disabling it. So if we then look at this increment character function, or I'm sorry, not the increment character, we're going to look at the insert character. So this is when you are pressing on that virtual keyboard a character. It's going to be a lot of the similar logic that we had with the key press, except it's a little bit more simple. So again, we're preventing the default. So we are not going to do any kind of post back to the Rails application. We just want to execute what's in this function. I'm first checking to see if the source element's ID is that little delete emoji. If it is, then we're going to call the function this.delete character. Otherwise, we're going to take the value of the button that we are pressing, or we're actually set it via the ID. So each one of those 26 or 27 buttons have an ID. The ID is the letter or the value, the text value, and we're setting it to our input target. And then we're simply calling the increment character, which I don't know if I have a screen for the increment character. Let me check, because that's kind of important. Oh, okay, I do. So let's go ahead and talk about the delete character. So the delete character, if we're on the second letter of our word and we hit the backspace, then we want to delete its contents. We want to then disable that text box, go to the previous text box, and then we want to be able to enable the previous one. And we're able to do that. First, again, I have a guard clause. This guard clause, we are just checking the modulus result to see if it equals 1, meaning that we don't want the user to go back to a previous word that they have already guessed. If they've already guessed a word, we want to prevent it from going back. So if they are on the middle of the word, we can then set the current text box to an empty value. We then disable it. We change our selection, which again is the global numeric value or state of which text box we are currently typing in. We set it back one value. We then have the input selection of the previous text box that we're now working with. We set its value to empty, and then we disable the, we set the previous text box, we enable it, and we then set the focus. So when we then type a letter or the increment character, which we saw in a few of these functions, so on the insert character, which is when you're pressing the keyboard, and on the key press, we call this function increment character. And that increment character is simply going to, again, do another guard clause check. And this guard clause is a little bit different than the other guard clauses. We are first checking to see, was the key press event or the key that we just inserted in via typing or pressing the button, was that the last letter in the word? If it was, then we're going to call the other function check word. If the game is finished, so we have a guard clause on line 3, if it is finished, then we are returning and we are not performing any other action. So this is where we are incrementing the selection. So on line 4, we initially, when we first start the game, our selection value is 0. We hit a character, it eventually calls the increment character function. Now this dot selection, thanks to line 4, has a value of 1. If the character selection, or if the selection is 30, meaning that we are basically at the very end of the game and the game was not won, then we are updating the result target with what the word was. Otherwise, if we are not at the 30th character selection, then we will continue on. We will then set the next selection or the next input target. We're going to enable it and then set our focus. Because on line 4, we incremented this dot selection, we are now going to be working with the next text box when we call lines 8 and 9. So we have two functions in here that we are calling that we haven't talked about yet. We have the check word, and we also have the game finished. The check word is going to be the business logic of that word. We're checking to see if we are going to be, if it's the correct word. We're checking each character individually to see if it's part of the word that was randomly selected. So we had to figure out what is the beginning of the word and what is the end of the word. We know whenever this function is called, we are at the end of the word. So we can take our start position is equal to this dot selection minus 4. We know that the end position is going to be this dot selection plus 1. We can then iterate over these. So we have on line 4 just a loop. We are starting with the start position. We're going up to the end position. And then we are going to basically remove some of the class elements, the styling on line 5. So within Bootstrap, you can't have something like a button success, and you also, or a background success, as well as, I'm sorry, you can't have a button success as well as a background outline dark. They're just kind of two different conflicting classes. And this is for the virtual keyboard. So we are essentially disabling or removing that class, the button outline dark. Then on line 6, we have our check on the words. So we have this dot word. We have our current position minus the start position is equal to the input target, which the input target again is the input boxes. We have 30 of them on the page. So if it is part of the word and it's in the correct position, then we are setting the class list of our input target to the background success. So our input box, we are making green. We are also then updating the virtual keyboard and adding it a class to it to be a button success. So now if you had the correct letter in the correct spot, we have a green input box and a green button in the virtual keyboard. On line 9, we have another conditional check. Otherwise, if this word includes and then the letter that we are currently checking, then we will change the background of the input box to a warning, which is in Bootstrap language, kind of like a yellow-orange. And we are also updating the button of the virtual keyboard to a button success. Because we did have the right character, we want to make the virtual keyboard a green button. Otherwise, so this means that if the letter was not in the correct letter in the correct position, and if the letter did not appear in the word at all, then, or if it did appear in the word, we're making it yellow. Otherwise, if neither of those are true, then we are adding a background secondary, which is a gray background, and we are then pushing to our wrong letters array the value. So again, this wrong letters array is just for our guard clause when we are typing a letter that we are essentially saying you cannot type this letter because it is not in the word. We are then updating the buttons, and we are adding a button secondary on line 15, and that button secondary is going to just kind of make it a dark gray, and then we are setting the attribute disabled to that button just so you cannot physically press on it to perform any kind of action. So that's the check word function. This is where the bulk of the business logic is happening to then update the view. We then have our other check, which is the game finished. And the game finished, again, we're just getting our start position and the end position, which is the current word. We're then checking, we're getting the input targets, we're slicing. So the input targets is our array of 30 different input boxes. We're then slicing it or just capturing a part of it. And then we are looping through that slice, getting the value of each one of those input boxes, and then we're joining it together with a empty string. So that way we have our word that we are testing. And then on line 5, we have our conditional. If this dot word is not equal to the word, so this dot word, again, is the random word that was selected in the initializer of our stimulus controller, then we're just going to exit the game finish because the game is not finished yet. Otherwise, if the game is essentially finished, we are then calling the input target selection. We're disabling the very last text box that we had typed in. We then update our result content with U1. We're then going through all 26 characters, and we are disabling all of the buttons on the virtual keyboard, and we return true. So that's our stimulus controller, and I can show you a demo of it now. So here I have the Wordle game that we've created with that stimulus controller up and running. I can try typing it in. We get our immediate response back with great. The GR and T are not in our game at all. However, the E and A are. So if I tried to type something like after, I can type the AF, but when I try to type the T character, nothing is happening. So after, it's not going to be a proper word because it's not going to be in here. I'm actually not really good at this game, so I think I am cheating here. Yeah, so the actual word is place. I put it in the console log to cheat. So I can then try to just hit the backscape character and try something else like, oh, the R's not in here. So I can try something else. I'm not actually doing a word check like the actual Wordle clone does. So we have our green box, and then we can try place, and it says we won. So I can refresh the screen again. We can play again. We can try something else. So I'll try to just fail the game, typing in the wrong letters. So on the very last letter, if I type in another wrong one, the word was right. So that is essentially Wordle's my version or implementation of Wordle.
That's fantastic. It's actually very clean and fast here too.
So I can bring up the actual code here that I am using. So this is the stimulus controller in its entirety. I'll delete that console log so we're not cheating. But you can see all of this ended up being just over 100 lines of code.
You could back out a little white space or something. You could tidy it up, but that's fantastic.
I could. So
that's super tight compared to like that rat's nest that you had that you showed that they had.
Yeah.
Huh. The question is, what did they write it in?
I have no idea.
Neither do I. Mean, obviously not vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're almost converting me over to Stimulus, Dave.
It's so nice. I'm telling you, it is really nice.
Yeah.
If you're not using Stimulus, you're missing out.
Yeah.
I prefer to add script tags to my ERB templates, like script language equals JavaScript. They just inline it because I'm a masochist. Anyway, no, this is fantastic. And it's super clean. Like you broke it down. The functions have very clear names for what they do.
Yeah, and honestly, when I first started, part of my thought process in getting this,
I love that there's a Dell character. Of course there is. I guess I didn't think about that. Yeah. Character map emoji.
I guess I could show if we did want to type on the keyboard, we can type on here. And we can also backspace.
What happens if you disabled them? But what if you like try to force yourself back to a previous position?
So because of the guard clauses, it won't go back to the previous word.
Okay.
And if I try to press something that's already grayed out, it won't let me.
Okay. What if you mouse over to the O and change it, like in the text box?
Oh, I'm not disabling here.
They didn't look disabled to me. Okay.
So that's Wordle. It's not the perfect clone.
No, it's fine.
Enough clone.
It's that this is a really great demonstration of these techniques.
You got to leave it to the security expert to go through each of the user edge cases of how they're going to break it.
Right. Like what happens if you inspect element and you re-enable the field and then change it?
Oh, for sure. Because if it's just vanilla JavaScript, there's nothing disabling that.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, the stakes are pretty low for a game. You're just cheating yourself.
You are cheating yourself. And and if you think about it, he's not even submitting anything past this JavaScript layer.
No.
So someone getting in there to manipulate.
No, there's. I mean, again, it would
Unfolding.
it would be like bragging rights or something crazy.
Yep.
It doesn't matter.
You're only cheating yourself, Frank.
I know. I'm not saying anything else other than that. Anyway,
Great.
so delete char. Let's go back to that method real quick. You have a guard clause at the top of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh.
So what you're saying is, that's just so you don't go back to the previous row.
Correct.
Okay. And then otherwise you're just wiping out the input target. You are disabling it. Oh, that's right, because you're going to be enabling the previous position.
Yep.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean this makes a lot of sense. I guess if you were being purely pedantic, you would break those into smaller named functions or have a comment, but I think for this purpose, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
That was my thought.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure this could be tidied up a bit nicer. This is one thing I miss about
you
jQuery
could
days.
You could assign all those multiple things. I guess you could just drop this input target selection into like a local variable, so you didn't have to like have that long drawn out lookup every time. I don't know, but yeah. I'm sorry. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I do miss the jQuery days of something like this. You could just do set adders, set the value to 0, comma, disabled, false, and then you can chain in like focus on it. So that could have been a one-liner, but we're not using jQuery here, so
Yeah, that's okay.
And you are talking about JavaScript at a Ruby meetup.
Yeah, I mean, it is stimulus, which is part of Rails. So,
hey, there's your Ruby.
There you go.
Hey, that's where we're getting it from.
Dun, dun, dun. Hey, there's not a new line at the end of that word. No, I'm just kidding. That's so picky.
Someone didn't cop it.
Dave, no, this is utterly fantastic. Like, if I sat down and I'm like, I'm going to make a Wordle clone, I'm sure mine would look 10 times uglier than this. I love it. It really is great.
Dave, correct me. Well, tell me if I'm wrong. Stimulus can be used outside of Rails, correct? Like it's not a Rails dependent dependency. Like it can be used where you want it to as like another JavaScript framework-esque thing, even though it's not a framework.
Yes, absolutely. And they publish it on the NPM registry, so if you have just a normal website, you can NPM add it in and do this completely without Rails at all. I mean, we didn't need Rails for this. The only Ruby-esque part of it is a word list, which we could have just inserted into the stimulus controller.
Well, and you also had the Ruby that built the page. You had the ERB Ruby.
The index.html.ruby,
yeah, that did some loops and things.
Yeah, but even this is pretty clean as far as just iterating over each one of these.
So let me ask you this, and this is almost embarrassing to ask. You're like, Frank, go watch my previous stimulus videos, which I should do. If I'm just sitting here with an app and I have a page and I'm like, you know what, this page needs some JavaScript loving. It needs some business logic for whatever reason. Do I just create a stimulus controller that I include in that page and then I do that logic there?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. In other words, Frank, you're asking, did I do something wrong because I have to ask if I need JavaScript to do something?
No, let's just assume it's an innocent like JavaScript. Yeah. That may be a valid question, but that's not what I'm asking here. I'm just like, so like, I can just be like, hey, I need to do, let's throw one out there, like all of us line of business app people. this is a really complicated form, and we need some validation, like client-side validation, because round trip's too hard. Would I just throw stimulus in to do that validation, or would I be better off doing it some other way? I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, I just generated a stimulus controller, because I'm using Rails. We had the nice little helper generate stimulus that's going to update the manifest. So it's going to run a rake task. It's also going to create the controller. The manifest, or it's just this index action where we are then registering a controller. So we had this data controller copy. So if we wanted to do something silly like in here within this stimulus controller, there's nothing to say that we can't add another stimulus controller. So we have now a data controller copy on this particular object where we're displaying the results. And then we can do something within the stimulus controller to, we could make it a target or something like that, but I don't know what the actual JavaScript thing is to do a copy.
Okay.
But
no, I'm just I am coming around to recognizing how clean this code is compared to maybe how you might do it with pure JavaScript.
And the beauty is reusability. Like when you really do get the cleanness broken down to like a single responsibility that this thing is doing, like form validation, and if you don't need, if you're talking about a regex for email, for instance, that the name is included, et cetera, like there's some things that probably could be used throughout your application, and wrapping your form or putting directly on the form element that data controller allows you to share that those validations throughout your app or your website, versus having Frank having to inline that in every single form. And when maybe you find out your email regex isn't working the way you wanted it to, now you have to go back and potentially update it in all those locations. I know you can include the JavaScript specifically for that, but it kind of cleans up reusability.
I like it. And apparently you can make Wordle in 120 lines of code.
That's pretty rad.
That is very rad.
Yep. $10,000 per line of code.
If only. Unfortunately, the clone market is not as good as the first mover. What you gotta do is make a similar game and go to the LA Times and say, don't you want to do something that the New York Times doesn't have?
I do have some ideas. I'm going to explore those.
I mean,
I think to talk about stimulus more and how great it is it's not just held to what was happening there on the screen where you're initializing, going through your initialization, creating your constructor there, running some functions, and then kind of manipulating the DOM all in the front end. Like it is a huge part of Hotwire, right? But it also allows you to do callbacks in a way of when this is, and this was something I saw on the Hotwire oh man, the word is going to elude me at the moment.
Discourse?
Kind of, yeah, the Hotwire discourse. It wasn't Discord. It was wow, that word is not going to come to me at all. Forum. Thank you. In the Hotwire forum, they were talking about how when we needed Hotwire to kind of realize something was happening on the page, but in general, when a page is refreshed, sometimes you want something to happen every time. And so we try to create these page event listeners, et cetera, but you can use your controller, because on that connect, like he said, it initializes right away. So you can think about it in a way that the DOM lifecycle events that are happening are integrated directly into that controller, and you don't really have to maintain them. You just have to connect or listen for them in one central place. So I think it provides a lot of power. Like, it looks really simple, but it provides a lot of power and extensibility for some pretty intense, I would say, user interactions and very little lines of code. Without having to access Redux, etc. Because this is like I think the brilliant thing that's coming out that people are starting to come around to and realize is, like, your DOM really is a state store, because you can stick in those targets attribute values. They can get interpolated from ERB, right? And then, or you can dynamically stick them in there in different parts of your DOM and read from them without having to say, like, I need this complex state form Redux, something that's going to take care of that. And Stimulus just kind of handled it very easily.
See, I don't know, but I gotta think. I mean, maybe it's like in these days, React is so popular. It's like I almost hate it just because it's popular. Like, there's no that, and I've seen the downsides of them and maintainability from bad React. But I feel like this is so much cleaner. If you try to accomplish the same thing with React, it's going to appear so much more complicated than this.
Might also be the writers, though. People write crazy code. They try to like the idea of like functional programming or extraction into named, like, understand or comprehensible lines of code. Like, if it doesn't,
you can write messy code in any language and platform.
Yes.
I get what you're saying. Yes. Dave, I love this talk. I really appreciate it. Do you have this demo up on GitHub, or is this secret sauce for your Empire building?
No, but it is going to be my episode that I covered this weekend on Script and Ruby.
Cool. Awesome. I love it. I really do need to try. I do need to try to come around to JavaScript, because 24 years of trying to avoid it, or only doing it in really hacky ways,
honestly, before Stimulus, so when we had the asset pipeline for everything and that kind of stuff, whenever I was writing JavaScript, it was messy. It was not well organized. Even though I was using jQuery, that's beside the fact. But I would often have JavaScript leaking from one page to the next, or it firing on pages I wasn't expecting it to. So,
especially interacting with turbolinks.
Yeah, trying to do some kind of page-specific JavaScript and that kind of junk. I don't think I've ever had a stimulus controller leak. So when it is on a different page, that stimulus controller initializer, that data controller doesn't exist, the code is just there, not doing anything. So it's been really nice from that aspect. And it also forces you to kind of think about how you're going to write it and encapsulate the code. Yeah, I could have put everything here under like the connect function or just a different function, but that would have been a bit messier, but at least it's still all contained. I don't have to worry about leaking over and disabling other input on key presses and that kind of stuff.
My wife opened the door. She knows how to get the alarm. Okay. So actually, right now, talking about leaking, I can share, because this is just something I hacked together. I am making a little bit of a Rails app that shows some media, and it has like a page where it's like a full screen view, and it has it's just plain Rails, right? So it has turbo links enabled and stuff. And it has like a next and back button, and it has an X. And these really are links to other pages other than the way. Can you kind of picture what I'm saying? So it looks like you have a full screen view. You can go to the next or the previous one. You can click X to go back to the gallery view or something. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was like, it would be really cool if I could use keyboard shortcuts to do these things too. And so I just threw a little JavaScript thing in there with some guard stuff. to actually, when you press the right arrow or the back arrow, it finds the page element that's the arrow and clicks it, and vice versa. And so it works, but with TurboLinks especially, that JavaScript tries to execute on lots of pages, and so I have to put that guard in because otherwise it's going to crash all over the place and burn. Like, try this, and if you exception raises, catch the exception so that you don't kill my JavaScript execution. Would it be... Is this like a candidate for a super easy stimulus controller instead, maybe? And see.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have this page that you have your gallery navigation, if you just have a when you're defining the stimulus controller, you can add some custom listeners for like a key press, but it's only going to listen for those when that stimulus controller is actually painted on the page. So if you navigate away hitting the X button or something, which navigates you away, then that stimulus controller's not initialized anymore, or it's not connected, rather. And because it's not connected, those specific key press event listeners won't fire.
Do you have to maybe the event will fire, but the listener won't catch it anymore because the controller isn't connected? Or do you have to do like an on disconnect, handle the taking away the event listener? Because some people like add it to the window.
Yeah. So I think the proper route, whenever you are doing anything like that, specifically in stimulus, when you're connecting a stimulus controller, you're adding some key press event listeners, there is a disconnect function that will automatically trigger as you navigate away or that stimulus controller is removed from the DOM. So it would be best practice to then dispose of those event listeners.
Fantastic. And this actually, I feel like this is a good use case. Most web pages could probably be improved with some keyboard shortcuts. I mean, very useful.
That reminds me, I think it was the most recent Ruby Weekly went over how to create the Command K functionality to navigate through your app, similar to how some people use we use Basecamp now, and you Command K, or you go to GitHub and Command K, and a little search box will pop up. If you use Mac, it's Command Space. It's a hotkey to push up an easy way to search, but also to run certain functionality. And I think the same thing. Like if you're using a user, like a power user, right? They learn those macro shortcuts to be able to jump quickly to the things that they need. And I think a lot of pages, that are highly trafficked or highly used, power users would like those.
It's kind of something we lost, like back in, if we sat down to make a business application in like 95, it'd feel very natural to have drop down menus and keyboard shortcuts for the commonly used functionalities, and you'd have your toolbar with your little 16 pixel icons. Like there was a design language to it, right? Like, and now it seems like, we've lost a lot of that in web app design.
So have we gone full circle where, scroll jacking bad, keyboard jacking good?
Maybe. Well, I mean, it depends on like what you're jacking, right? And what you're capable of. Scrolling, I feel like that's the mouse hover. I don't know.
Apple's website on the new Mac Stadium actually is a pretty good example of what I consider to be scroll jacking, where you're expecting to scroll down the page, but instead of scrolling, it then kind of shows the Mac Stadium and rotates it as you're scrolling down.
I hate that.
I don't know what you're talking about. What's a Mac Stadium?
Not the Mac Stadium, the effect. Sorry.
If I go to apple.com,
Yeah. Yeah. The Mac Stadium is their newest, latest, and greatest Mac Mini. Mac Mini Pro. Mac Mini Pro Max Ultra.
is it Stadium or Studio?
Studio. Shoot. My bad.
So here's another one, because I got really annoyed looking at people's UX that scroll jacking apparently is the term with it. As you're scrolling, each element like pops up, or as you get there, it slowly, when you get on the page. And I'm like, this isn't asynchronous rendering, because they're very simple things to put onto the page, but it's a conscious choice to have things show up on the page, almost as if putting like a sleep between each one of them. And like I thought about it, and I'm like, I get it in a way of like, if your UX flow is designed to drive someone's eyes to like a call to action, an affordance to do something. I'm doing all this so you'll do something. But most of the time, it's just because you see this scroll jacking effect as you come in, that everything just slides into the screen, and there's lots of stuff coming at you in animation.
Of course, they've made a proprietary power adapter cable. That like drew my eyes. Like, that's not a normal Molex. Sorry, Nico, carry on. Let me not mess you up.
No, it's just my rant. Like, it just annoys me to have that happen, and how many people see that and do it because they believe it's good UX flow. It's pretty.
So I Googled it because I didn't know what it was, and the first thing that popped up was an article called "Scroll Jacking: The Usability Nightmare?" ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That messing with someone's scrolling is similar to driving your car, pressing the horn button, but instead of honking, your wipers switch on.
Short circuit, yeah. I think they're different. I think they have different things. So scrolling is something you expect to do. I think keyboard shortcuts, when done right, are a different thing. Like, you would advertise it, right? It's kind of like, I mean, obviously it's a little bit harder on iPad, but the thing that always annoys me for decades was like forms that had like an option box, but they didn't set the labels for the option box, so you had to go hunting for the little circle. Even though if they had just set the label for attribute, like there's tons of stuff like that. But like using tooltip, for example, on your A-link, so that when you hover, you get an explanation of what it is. Like, there's a ton of powerful features built in that just improve usability. They're just easy to overlook.
Guys, I gotta go.
Bye, Nico.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Hi, Nico.
Well, fantastic. Dave, I want to say thank you very, very much. I seriously appreciate it. And you got me like really seriously thinking that stimulus is pretty great. So you accomplished two things. One, awesome Wordle, and two. So thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone have any questions? I'm going to stop the recording.